All right, let's turn to Meet the Depressed.
Good Sunday morning. President Trump's foreign policy is facing its most urgent test of his new term as efforts ramp up to negotiate an end to Russia's war in Ukraine, which is about to enter its fourth year. World leaders gathered at the Munich Security Conference this weekend, where tensions mounted over mixed messaging from the president and his top officials.
You've suggested several things that Ukraine should give up. The idea of NATO membership, territory that was seized back in 2014 by Russia. What should Russia give up?
Russia has gotten themselves into something that I think they wish they didn't.
NATO allies were reportedly blindsided by news of President Trump's call with Vladimir Putin and frustrated that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth appeared to make concessions to Russia.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Hegseth, after a backlash.
You know what's crazy about the backlash over Hegseth saying that is that Joe Biden, after basically provoking a war over Ukraine's membership in NATO, which he refused to take off the table when Russia asked him to, after hundreds of thousands of people got killed as a result, Biden, at the very end of his presidency, said, you know what? Yeah, I don't think Ukraine's ready for NATO anyway. So Pete Hegseth is not really articulating something all that different from Joe Biden. The difference is that Hegseth is willing to make a commitment to it, whereas Biden was just being coy the whole time. He said, we have an open door policy. We're not going to take it off the table. But then when it came time for Ukraine to ask, please let us into Ukraine, he's like, no, you're not ready. So what does that mean? It just means that Biden was using the prospect of the open door to use Ukraine as a backdoor through which NATO could fight Russia and bleed Russia.
Yeah.
And now the Trump administration is talking about putting an end to that.
I mean, I think that Hegseth is a totally odious person. I think it's shameful that he's was confirmed. But I have to say that, echoing what you just said, if anything, Hegseth is being more honest than the Biden administration was being, right? Like, they use the possibility of NATO membership, knowing full well they would never do it. So people should actually appreciate this. And also, this whole idea of making concessions to Russia, like, all negotiations involve concessions. Both sides have to make concessions. So I don't know why that's a bad thing. And of course, like, not giving Ukraine NATO membership would also be sticking to the US's word from the 90s and creating the conditions like needed to potentially, God forbid, end this war.
Yeah, it's really not a big concession if you look at the history. As you mentioned, this was promised to the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War that NATO would not expand further to the east. And then, Ukraine itself, in its own declaration of state sovereignty, after it became independent, said, we aim to be a neutral state, so therefore not a NATO or a Russian-led military bloc state. And then if you look at Ukrainian public opinion for like most of the last 20 plus years, the majority has been against NATO membership. That only increased after Russia invaded and after the polls were no longer taking into account all the breakaway Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine that like rebelled against the coup that happened in 2014. So Ukrainian public opinion has always been split on this, as has always been recognized. Like, there's documents from WikiLeaks and elsewhere that say that, like, the internal U.S. government documents that are like, one problem we have in trying to expand NATO to Ukraine is Ukrainian public opinion. So, that's kind of a deterrent. So it's actually not that big of a concession. And again, the question is, do we want to be spending tens of billions of dollars just so we can fuel a proxy war that is killing so many people to determine who gets to rule over eastern Ukraine, where I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there's a lot of people who rebelled against the coup government we helped impose in 2014 and who actually want to be aligned with Russia. So is it worth fueling this ongoing war over what is basically Ukraine's own internal split? And the best thing we can do is to stop fueling Ukraine's own internal division. Imagine that.
Right. Yeah. And you're going to see today, this theme is very present. This theme of equating diplomacy with, capitulation and basically an implicit support and preference for war over peace. And another thing to remember is, had the West not intervened earlier on, and blocking a negotiation between, Zelensky and Putin, the Ukraine would have more land than they're now
Absolutely.
going to have. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the question is, will that fact ever get admitted on corporate TV? It's been 3 years of war. I don't think that there's been one mention once on any of these shows that, oh yeah, there was a peace deal reached between these two sides back in April 2022, but we blocked it. No one's
Right.
talked to it's like you can't, there's like an oath of silence. You just can't acknowledge it. As we're going to see an example of later on today. In a world where it seems like we're constantly being listened to by our phones, our computers, security systems, and Alexas, it sometimes feels pointless to even hope for privacy anymore. Amazon, Meta, and Apple are all using your data to sell you ads. But what if we told you something else was listening to you in a much more nefarious way, using your data to sell you to third parties and governments? You may have already guessed what it is: AI. Think about what we tell these AI platforms: our thoughts, dreams, sensitive questions, business ideas, and more. They take all this information, tie it to your identity, and then sell it. ChatGPT literally has the former director of the NSA sitting on their board right now. That's why we recommend Venice.ai. Venice.ai is a generative AI platform that is private and permissionless. Here's how they do it. They utilize leading open source AI models to deliver text, code, and image generation to your web browser. There's no downloads, no installations of anything. Messages are encrypted, and your conversation history is stored only in your browser. And check out their Pro plan, which gives you access to PDF uploads for summaries or insights, plus high image limits and limitless text. If you want to use AI without fear of handing over your most intimate thoughts to a corporation or the government, you can get 20% off a Pro plan using our link, venice.ai/useful, and code USEFUL. Click the link in the description to get started.
Then saying everything is on the table. European leaders worry President Trump is giving leverage to Putin even before peace talks begin and signaling a desire to retreat from Europe. These comments by Vice President Vance at the Munich Security Conference setting off alarm bells.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values.
I sat down exclusively.
So the reaction to Vance's speech is interesting. Now, first of all, I agree with the statement that Vance made that like the threat is not from Russia and China. It is from within because there has been an erosion of values. But Vance and I do not share the same like examples of why that is. So he was talking about cracking down on like far right parties like in Germany, right? And and also on free speech in Europe. But what's funny is when he talked about the crackdown on free speech in Europe, he didn't mention what is the most egregious crackdown on free speech, which is the crackdown on Palestinian supporters. You know, we just saw recently Ali Abu Nima being arrested in Zurich before he was supposed to give a lecture about Palestine. And we've seen so many examples of this. And JD Vance didn't mention that at all because the Trump administration supports that crackdown on pro-Palestine free speech. Now, he did mention one example, which I think is really funny. We haven't actually covered this on the show. Presidential elections in Romania were recently canceled based on a Russiagate type allegation, where basically Romania all of a sudden claimed that like Russia was interfering with the election via TikTok. And so therefore they had to cancel the entire presidential election. And it turned out, of course, there was no evidence for that, just as there was no evidence for the Russiagate allegations here. But like the Russian interference boogeyman, just as it was used here to such disaster for so long, that was used to literally cancel an election in Romania. And I think that that's a good example that is worth bringing up. And he did point to that.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And of course, Vance didn't mention and would never mention Ali Abu Nima. Other people who we may want to mention here, Sarah Wilkinson, Richard Medhurst. These are activists and journalists. And, what's amazing, speaking of German freedom of speech, attacks on freedom of speech, is that a disproportionate number of the people who have been penalized for so-called anti-Semitism are Jewish. So you have Germany telling Jews that they're being anti-Semitic, and what makes them anti-Semitic? The fact that they are protesting for Palestinian rights.
Absolutely. And Richard Medhurst, he was first detained at in the UK after flying in from London and had
Right.
all his devices confiscated. And then he was recently raided in
In
Austria.
Austria. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and you've had so many other examples of this. And by the way, Richard Medhurst, despite like being like, harassed and detained, arrested in 2 different countries, like the British media totally ignored it. Just whatever. Like pro-Palestine journalist having all his devices seized, being detained under terror law, under for questioning under terror laws. Who cares? Who cares? And so does and the same attitude comes from the Trump administration, which lectures Europe about free speech, but does not touch the crackdown on free speech when it comes to Palestine.